is a, got it. What you're looking at is an image, a Braille image, and it's actually the word sympathy. So the first thing that I did when I stopped practicing law was to begin to work with an organization called the Chicago Lighthouse, which has been around for over 100 years in Chicago. It provides services for the blind and visually disabled. And one of the things they do, like many similar organizations, is they sell Braille greeting cards. But I decided that you don't want just a traditional Braille greeting card that just happens to have a Braille message inside, but why don't we try to do something that celebrates the design and elegance and beauty of the language of Braille. So if we look at this and look at it as a design, it was inspiring to me. So let's move forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what I did was literally take the Braille design and turn it into art. And I did this with, in this case, the word sympathy. So this is becomes a sympathy card, but the actual blueprint for it was the Braille design. And the reason I explain this and do this little detour is because using the message as the blueprint, as the design of the art is what inspired me in terms of how to work with the data on climate change. So next slide, please. And here is an example of a very dramatic graph, very simple, dramatic, but the reality is that many people don't have the patience or interest to study it. And so I'm trying to ask myself, how can I use this graph and others like it to help communicate the science of climate change? And I thought back to the Braille experience and said, let's make the graph form the basis of the art. So next page, next slide, please. Cat. So this is an example, one of the pieces from the collection of the art of climate change. There are over 35, over 100 pieces in this collection. And this is one where I literally, each one uses a chart, a graph, a map, a word or number as the basis of the piece. And as you can see how that was created, and that little transition shows you that it is actually the underlying graph. And the idea is that people, and you can move forward to the next one, we can move forward, because I'm not going to try to talk about the science of each piece as much as try to just give you a sense of how the art was created. Because people won't go to an exhibit of charts and graphs and maps, as important as they are. Most people don't find them very accessible, but art is accessible. So this is a very important piece that shows a graph that shows both the history and the projection of emission levels and how they relate to temperature change. And it's something that can actually impact, the difference between these two lines is the difference between 3.5 degrees and 9 degrees over the course of the century. So if we can move to the art, please. So in this case, I created the art the idea is to draw people in to the room, to start a conversation. People who are not interested in charts and graphs, people who may not necessarily believe in climate change, but are willing to look at art that's bright and colorful. The art is printed typically on an exhibit. It's printed large on metal. So it's shiny, nice shiny objects, draws people in, and it appears to be abstract. So they wonder what it is. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to wrestle with my cat because you can't keep her out. Anyway, if you could move forward, please, to the next one. This is an example, as you can see, of global sea level rise, and onto the art, please. So again, just creating what appears to be a piece of abstract art, using the science as the design. And again, let's move forward because I want to try and cover a lot of these, it's more of the concept and the process than the individual pieces. This one has to do with sources and sinks. It's an interesting fact about how the, essentially how the atmosphere has gotten filled with carbon, because as we've increased the amount of emissions and carbon in the atmosphere, there's only so many places it can go. The ocean absorbs 90% of it. Land absorbs a significant part. But as we run out of land and enough ocean to absorb all the increase, it ends up in the atmosphere. So you move on to the art for this piece, please. Thank you. And again, it's supposed to look like something different. So when you come up to this, you might see a moonscape, you might see, just lakes reflecting. Everybody will see something a little different. And one of the things that I try to go for is that little trick that, the double take, when you realize that it isn't anything close to what you thought it was. It's actually a graph of sources and sinks. We move forward, please. Thank you. This is sort of a fun piece, right? It's, part of what I try to do is create art in many different styles to appear to a lot of different people. So this piece, if you show, let's move on to the actual graph. It's actually pretty stunning, the graph, which is, if you look at temperature and CO2 for the last 1,000 years and look what's happened in the last couple hundred years, or really the last 100 years, you'll see, it doesn't get any more dramatic. And sometimes you have to look 1,000 years back to really see what is going on. If you just look at a small snippets of time, it doesn't have the same impact. Move forward, please. Thanks. So the idea when people see the art is, the pieces are exhibited with, you can see the little plaque on the bottom, and each plaque has the graph and the summary message. So the idea is you go up to the art, you're drawn to the art itself, hopefully. It's aesthetically pleasing, it's different, it's bright, as I said, and appears to be abstract. And then there is an engagement process when people are drawn in to see, once they realize this isn't abstract after all, they see it's based on a graph. So they'll read a little bit about the graph, and then they'll go back to the art and try and see where's the art, where's those lines, the blueprint of the graph in the art. And then they'll go back to read a little bit more about the science. And there's this back and forth engagement that creates a takeaway, a message that the viewer may not otherwise get. And so as you can see, in most of the exhibits, it will be about 20 pieces or so, you walk away with a sense of learning more about the different aspects. So we move forward, please. You can keep going past this piece. This is just this is an art, and then you'll see the art graph combination there, where you can see this has to do with the loss of coverage of ice in the Great Lakes. Again, visualizing the art and then the graph next to it, and the process of the back and forth process that helps you to become more involved and interested in the subject matter. Again, we move forward, please. So my process is to try and find a chart or a graph from a reliable source, usually a government agency, that covers a topic that I'm interested in, that I want to convey. But sometimes I don't find the particular graphic data that I feel I can work with. And so I would often create my own. So this image here is actually created from a word image. If you can move to the next slide, you can see it's about vector-borne diseases, and the actual image is the number of different types of vector-borne diseases that are increased by climate change, because as the world warms, there are more areas for these insects to multiply and become prolific. Next slide, please. So that's an example of a word image. Sometimes they're number images. This is a word image based on the word deforestation. We can move forward. And so, you know, as I say, if I showed you the actual underlying graph, you would just see there are no lines. There's just the word deforestation. This is the word drought. Very hard to see it. It's actually the black lines that you see in between the images. It's kind of a spidery effect. And that is using the word drought to create an image of drought. And move forward, please. Thanks. This piece is very abstract, obviously, but it actually speaks to the ethical issues of climate change. So this, as you'll see in the next graph, for a moment, let's look at the art for a second. That little red dot, just think about it as it relates to the size of the overall piece. And then let's advance to the maps that are the basis of this piece. This has to do with morality of climate change. So these two graphs, if you look at the top map of the globe, it shows you the per capita emissions, the areas of the globe where the greatest emissions have come from, which is the most developed countries, the first world countries, if you will. And then if you look down below, you'll see the areas that are affected. And in the only area that is highly affected, that is also a source of the greatest emissions, is the dark little red area below that you can see. And that was the area that I was focused on in the original painting, making the point that in almost all cases, for most of the globe, there is a disconnect between the people who cause the problem and the people who will suffer the most from it. So we can move forward, please. The art also addresses some of the risks to different species on Earth, not only humans, but also in this case, it deals with the risk to marine life. And if we can move forward to the image, the next image. It's very sad to see how as the oceans get warmer and acidify from the carbon that they're storing, the acidification affects the bone structure of some of these shell creatures. And so it's terribly sad to see how they can't form the same bone and shell structure as they could before. And this is happening in many different species in many different ways across the oceans and other parts of the world, of course. We move forward, please. Along the same lines, this piece was created, again, I try to create a disconnect between what the feel of the piece and what it's actually about, because I think there's a jolt that happens when you realize that it's actually a serious issue. In this case, the piece almost looks like a tic-tac-toe board, almost like a game. The colors are lighthearted and pleasant and bright, but what it actually represents is every red X on the board actually represents, and there are, of all the marks, the circles and X's together, 1 out of 4 is a red X. And that represents that 1 out of 4 species is at risk of extinction by the middle, the number of species by the end of the century because of climate change. Really being at risk of being crossed off the planet. This piece is, again, very different, and I try to make them very, each one unlike the other. This one is actually a collage of, it looks sort of like Egyptian hieroglyphics, I think, but if you move to the next slide, you'll see what it's based on. And it's intended to show the scope of the risk. So it's called The Many Plagues of Climate Change. It's made up of these hazard signs that deal with heat and fire and floods and risks to species and vector-borne diseases and intense storms. So it's all about the many different ways, what melting glaciers, melting ice. It's the climate change isn't any one thing. And sometimes people think about global warming and they think it's getting hotter, but there are so many aspects and so many different kinds of impacts. Maybe go to the next slide, please. This is a seemingly very abstract piece. but it's actually based on the impact of climate change on wildfires. So if we can move quickly to the graph. You're doing a great job, by the way. Thank you so much. This just is briefly, this is just demonstrates the increase in wildfires, which are more intense, cover more acreage and last longer and are more frequent than in the past. And this has to do with the heat and the dryness from drought. If we move forward, please. This piece is based on a graph that relates to the urgency of action, and we can move forward with the graph. It's kind of hard to explain, but the gist of it is that the longer you wait, the more extreme the action that would be necessary to prevent catastrophic results. And that's what these red lines that to the right that go further down. It ultimately reflects the need to take action that will be based in part on science and technology that does not exist yet. So the sooner we act, the more we can rely on resources that are currently available. But as we wait longer, we have to take more extreme and drastic action and rely on things that we just have to hope will come into existence. Next slide, please. Also costs a lot more. This is a piece that uses the words underneath. It's the underlying sketch of this is the words buy, throw away, buy, throw away. It represents sort of a take on the religious aspects of climate change. In 2015, Pope Francis issued an encyclical which talked about climate change and the need to protect the earth. And he lamented our consumer society where we buy things, we throw them away, then we buy some more and we throw them away. So it's buy, throw away is the underlying words of this piece. So climate change has so many different aspects as we've seen. It's not only science, it's ethics, it's morals, it's religion, it's political, of course, as we all know. Next slide, please. So now we come into a more current crisis. This piece is actually inspired by the COVID crisis. And what it relates to, if you take a look at the piece, but if you move on to the graph on the next page. So what this was created by me during the first year of the pandemic, so 2020 at the beginning. And well, actually a little bit further into the year when we began to see that one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that global emissions were going down because everybody was staying home. So people weren't basically as active as they were. So we had a 7% drop in global emissions. But what this chart shows, we also had of course, a very significant contraction of our economies globally. But what this graph showed is that in the past, every time we had a major economic downturn, even though we had a very temporary dip in emissions, they popped right up again. So as you can see, going all the way back to 1971, with the various recessions that we faced, we would dip and then we would pop up again. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened in 2021. Is that the temporary respite that we had from emissions popped right back up again. And so we're seeing that we have not learned, we haven't taken advantage of the situation anyway. We're back to our bad habits again. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I wanted to do here is to talk to you guys as an audience of young people, brilliant, wonderfully talented young people who not only know how to share my screen, but also are going to save the world. And I think that the discussion about COVID is actually a very good segue into this because there are limits to what science can do. In that case, we saw science deliver the miracle of vaccines, but human nature is what it is. And in many ways, our own obstinacy or some of us has thwarted what science was able to do. And so we can't solve that problem. In many ways, we were likely to have the same problem with climate change, even as it becomes very evident, as we see 116-degree temperatures in Oregon and wildfires running out of control. We will still find people that don't want to see data. Maybe there's some things some common themes, like this piece is based on one of these common themes of when we move forward to the graph. And this has to do with, the idea that it's impossible. It's just not feasible. There are many, many studies now that show that there are a combination of renewable energy sources that would get us to a 90% clean energy by 2035. Some of the goals are 2030, some of them are 2050, but some people may be convinced by the data. Let's move to the next piece, please. Sorry. This is another thing that I know I've heard, and you may have heard also, people who tend to be climate deniers or just not aware, knowledgeable will say, this is just a normal cycle. We've had them before. These are solar flares. They're just normal impacts of nature. So if we move on to the graph that this piece is based on, this becomes evidence that maybe some of you can use these types of graphs and data that's out there that shows the impact of human, the temperature versus solar activity. If it was just solar activity, you would actually see things getting cooler, and instead they're getting much warmer. This is just one of the many, many pieces of data that you can use to try and address people who are, questioning or wondering about about the science of climate change. Then move forward, please. So what I think that just rounding out the discussion about climate change, I think that the challenge for you guys is to succeed where we have failed. And even though science is likely to continue to evolve and to help provide some of the solutions that we need, your challenge, in particular in the world that we live in, the divided world we live in, is to become ambassadors of truth and to be able to figure out ways where the science will actually be embraced and accepted, ways to engage. Art, I think, is a wonderful vehicle because art crosses boundaries. It crosses geographic boundaries, religious, language, political, ideological. Everybody can appreciate art. Art can get people into the room. You can begin a discussion with people. An exhibit that looks like a bunch of abstract paintings can get people who would never want to talk about climate change to start talking about climate change. It is a very powerful vehicle when you engage your emotions as well as your mind. But you guys are going to have to learn how to use all of these tools, whether it be art or everything else, to try and engage people in meaningful dialogues without alienating them. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for you, because the art can be a tool. I've used this art as a tool for communication about climate science, but there has to be a receptivity to the information, and that's where I think you guys can be successful, where we have not been. Now, if as I said, I'd like to do a very brief detour to cover a few other series that I've done. This piece is from a series called Art Against Hate, which I was inspired to create during the early Trump years, particularly after the incident in Charlottesville. Just talk about pieces that address both historical atrocities and courage. This particular piece is it's called A Rainbow of Misery, and it is the blue stripes represent the uniforms that the Nazi forced the prisoners to wear in the camps, And the different colored hues, they had their own diabolical color-coded system based on who you were, whether you had a different color if you were homosexual, or if you were a Roma, or a political prisoner, or a Jew. And so this piece represents that, the colors and stripes of the camp. That's to remind us of those days. Will you move forward, please? This piece is actually, again, appears to be very abstract, is actually 917 dots. And each dot represents a hate group that existed. I believe it was the end of 2019, according to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And it's just, to me, this was a way of representing the enormity, the dense, the number. I mean, it just seems like an infinite number, but it's a staggering number. And again, this is part of the way to use art to express different types of messages for different types of missions and causes. Can we move on, please? Oh, so finally, I wanted to finish with some personal note about a series that I created when I was being treated a few years ago for breast cancer, and I created a series relating to chemotherapy. What I wanted to do was to create an artistic journal of sort of a day by day of experiencing chemotherapy. The main purpose of this was to challenge myself and to hopefully share with others going through similar types of experiences, to live through the anxiety on a day-by-day basis and allow for the experience to, the days to paint themselves, if you will. Each one was supposed to be how that day went for me, how I felt during that day. And the reason I did it is that so many people who go through treatments like this imagine that they're going to have months and months of absolute misery, that it's like falling into a dark hole. But what I would try to emphasize is, well, let's let the good days happen too, or the good mornings, or parts of the day, or maybe a whole good day. And so I tried to record the different types of emotions, feelings I had. This is one of the, the darker pieces. It showed anxiety waiting for test results. And if you can move forward to the next piece. Oops. All right, so somehow we got another piece dropped. But this is a 20, is this the last piece, or is that, is this the last one in the series? The other one didn't get out of order? I guess it didn't make it. Yeah, I think it didn't make it. The point is there are 20 pieces in that series, and some of them are actually kind of cheerful. And in fact, if you look at the 20 pieces collectively, it will not be a depressing. It's sort of a colorful, this was life. This was a period of one's life where there were a few moments that were difficult, but many, many moments that were pleasant or interesting, or, maybe otherworldly, surreal, but still not. It was the idea of not adding anxiety and prejudging and, adding a cloud of anxiety to the experience, but allowing yourself to have the good days when they happen, to have the good moments when they happen. And that was trying to use the art to help send that message and to provide that assurance to people. So this is obviously the end of the presentation. I should say one other thing. I'm happy to say that on Monday, the United Nations is coming out with a very major report. It's a report that comes out every 7 years or so, and they commissioned me to do the art for the cover. So please look for that. It's called the Sixth Assessment. And I think more importantly, try to read it, as much of it as you can, and begin to educate yourself, because it is going to be the state of the art of climate science. And that's obviously very critical for all of us, but particularly for you guys who will be dealing with that issue many, many years to come.